I'm going to tell y'all a story about my childhood here in eastern Kentucky, and I'm warning you right now, it ain't pretty. It's going to make you mad, might make you cry. But somebody needs to hear it, 'cause what happened to me still happens to kids today. When I was 12 years old, my stepdaddy started waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, every single day. He'd come into that loft where I was sleeping, yank me out of bed, sometimes throw cold creek water on me if I didn't move fast enough, and he'd say, "Get up, girl, time to work." And then he'd hand me that hoe, that big, heavy, wooden-handled hoe, the one I'd have to hold for the next 10, 12 hours, out in them tobacco fields under the Kentucky sun. Sun so hot it'd blister your skin, so bright you couldn't see straight. That hoe handle was hard wood, rough, got splinters if you wasn't careful. And Lord, it got hot under that sun, burned your hands. But I couldn't let go. If I stopped working, if I put that hoe down, I'd get a whipping. Belt or switch didn't matter, so I held it. And I cried from the pain in my hands, from the pain in my back, from the shame of being treated like a pack mule when I was just a child. I did that for 6 years, from age 12 to 18, 6 years holding that hoe. 6 years being nothing but free labor for a man who wasn't even my real daddy, while my mama watched and did nothing. Until one day, he fell right there in the field, asking me for help. And I just stood there, watching, for a good long while. What did I do? Did I help him? Did I let him die? That's what I'm fixin' to tell you today, the whole story. How I ended up slavin' in them fields, why my mama let it happen, and what I did the day he needed me for once. My name's Betty Lou Jenkins, well, Betty Lou Watson now, and I'm 78 years old. I was born in 1946 in a place called Possum Creek Hollow, way up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Most folks today don't know what life was like back then in the hollers, how isolated we was, how poor, how trapped. The mountains of Appalachia might look pretty on postcards, but they can be a prison when you're born poor. Those beautiful ridges that tourists come to photograph, they was walls keeping us in, keeping help out, hiding what happened to children like me. I'm telling this story now because I'm old, and I won't be around forever. And because I saw on the TV that there's still children today, right here in America, not just some far-off country, working in fields just like I did, still getting robbed of their childhood, still getting hurt. And I can't abide that. Not when I know exactly what it does to a child's body, to their spirit. Some of you might have clicked on this thinking it was going to be something dirty. The way they write headlines these days, I know how it sounds. 12-year-old girl forced to hold something hard and hot for hours. Well, I ain't mad if that's why you're here. At least now you're listening. And maybe you'll do something about it when you know the truth. My childhood ended the day my real daddy died. He was a coal miner, like most men in eastern Kentucky back then. Went down in that dark hole every day to scratch out a living for us. Dangerous work, deadly work. But it was all there was. When that mine elevator cable snapped and plunged 400 feet down the shaft with my daddy and 11 other miners inside, I was 8 years old. Old enough to understand what death meant, but not old enough to understand why the coal company only gave us $500 for my daddy's life. $500. That's what a man's life was worth to them. Barely enough to feed us for 6 months. My mama was left with 4 young'uns and no way to feed us. Back then, there wasn't all the government programs there is now. No real welfare to speak of. Just church charity and the goodwill of neighbors who was almost as poor as we was. That's how Earl Tucker came into our lives. A widower with a tobacco farm who needed a wife to cook and clean. A man who saw in my mama not a love match, but a business transaction. A woman desperate enough to say yes to anything that meant her children wouldn't starve. Everybody works, everybody eats. That was Earl's motto. And at first, it seemed fair enough. We all did chores, fetching water, feeding chickens, tending the garden. Normal things that kids in the country did. But Earl was watching me, calculating, waiting till I got big enough to be really useful to him. And when I turned 12, he decided it was time. That first morning, April 1958, When he yanked me out of bed at 4 a.m., I thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe he just needed extra help that day. I didn't understand that my childhood was over. That from that day forward, I wasn't a child anymore in his eyes. I was a tool, free labor, property. The weight of that hoe in my small hands that first day. I can still feel it. Too heavy for a 70-pound girl to lift properly. My arms started shaking after just a few minutes. But Earl didn't care. "You'll get used to it," he said, and went back to his own row. By the end of that first day, my hands were covered in blisters, painful, water-filled bubbles that burst and bled as I kept working. My back felt like somebody had taken a hammer to it. My neck couldn't hold my head up straight. I cried myself to sleep that night, praying it was just a bad dream. But 4 a.m. came again, and again, and again. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The routine never changed. Up at 4, in the fields by 4:30, work till noon, 30-minute break for lunch, usually just beans and cornbread. Back to work till 6, then fetch water from the creek. 6 trips with a 20-pound bucket balanced on my head. Help Mama with supper. Collapse into bed by 9, sleep till 4. Repeat. School became a distant memory. "School don't matter for girls," Earl said. "You're just gonna get married anyway. Need to learn workin', not readin'." My mama, who I'd loved and trusted my whole life, said nothing. Did nothing. When I begged her to let me go back to school, she just shook her head. "Can't go against Earl," she whispered. "He'll throw us out. We'll starve." So I worked, and I changed. The blisters on my hands turned to calluses. The sunburns became permanent tan lines. My growth stunted from malnutrition and overwork. My body aged decades in just a few years. What happens to a child who's treated like an animal? They either break completely or they harden. I hardened, had to survive. The little girl who loved to sing and play in the creek disappeared. In her place grew a silent, watchful creature who learned that the less she said, the less trouble she got. But inside, deep inside where Earl couldn't reach, a spark remained. A tiny flame of rage that wouldn't die. That grew stronger with every blow, every cruel word, every dawn that found me standing in those tobacco rows instead of sleeping safe in bed like a child should. That flame kept me alive through 6 years of hell. And it was still burning bright on that hot June day in 1964 when Earl Tucker fell face first into the dirt and looked up at me, the child he'd tortured for 6 years, and begged for help. What did I do in that moment? Well, that's the story I'm about to tell you. I was born in a place most folks couldn't find on a map if they tried. Possum Creek Hollow ain't even a real town, just a collection of cabins and shacks tucked deep in the eastern Kentucky mountains where the coal seams run thick and the opportunities run thin. Our hollow was named for the creek that cut through it and the possums that was about the only thing that thrived there besides misery. My daddy, Roy Jenkins, worked the Blackstone mine, just like his daddy before him, and probably would have been my brother's fate too if things had turned out different. Daddy was a good man, tired to the bone most days from spending 10-12 hours in the dark, but he always had a smile and a hug for me when he came home. "You're my big girl, Betty Lou," he'd say, swinging me up even though his back was probably screaming from being hunched over a coal seam all day. "Gonna do great things someday. Maybe even go to high school." That was as far as his dreams for me could stretch. High school. In our hollow, that was aimin' high. We lived in what city folks would call a shack, though we never thought of it that way. 4 rooms total, kitchen, front room, and 2 small bedrooms. Tar paper on the outside to keep the wind from whistling through the cracks in winter. No electricity. We used kerosene lamps at night. No running water. Every drop had to be hauled from the creek in buckets. The outhouse was a good 50 feet behind the house, which made midnight trips in winter a special kind of torture. But it was home, and we had more than some. We had a garden that gave us vegetables in summer, beans, corn, potatoes, tomatoes. We had chickens for eggs. Daddy would sometimes bring home a squirrel or a rabbit he'd shot on the way home from the mine. On real good days, there might even be a possum or groundhog for the pot. We never went hungry. Not completely, though there were plenty of watered-down soup days toward the end of winter when the garden was long empty and the money was tight. I was the oldest of 4 children. After me came Junior, 2 years younger, then Sissy, 4 years behind me, and finally Bobby, the baby, 6 years younger than me. Being the oldest meant I was Mama's right hand from early on. While Daddy was in the mines, I helped with the young'uns, fed the chickens, fetched water, helped in the garden. Normal chores for a mountain child, not the exploitation that would come later. Mama, Loretta Jenkins, was like a lot of mountain women. Strong, capable, worn down by hard living and childbearing. She could make something out of nothing, stretching food when it was scarce, turning flour sacks into dresses for me and Sissy, keeping us all clean despite having to heat every drop of water on the wood stove. She did quilting for a little extra money when she could. Beautiful patterns like wedding ring and Star of Bethlehem that she sold to a lady from Lexington who'd come through the mountains a few times a year. When I think back on those early years before everything changed, I remember them as hard but happy. Yes, we was poor, but so was everybody else in the hollow. Yes, the work was never ending, but we did it together, as a family. In summer, when the chores was done, I'd go exploring with Junior, catching crawdads in the creek, picking blackberries from the brambly bushes that grew wild on the hillsides, lying on our backs in the high meadow grass watching clouds roll by. I went to school when I could, which wasn't as often as it should have been. The one-room schoolhouse was 3 miles away, and in winter, with snow piled high or the creek flooded, it was near impossible to get there. But when I did go, I loved it. Miss Johnson, the teacher, said I had a quick mind and always gave me extra books to take home. I could read by age 6, which was unusual for hollow children. "You keep at those books, Betty Lou," Miss Johnson would say. "They're your ticket out of these mountains, if you want it." I didn't understand then what she meant. The mountains was my home. Why would I want a ticket out? I didn't yet know they was a kind of beautiful prison. Life had a rhythm in the hollow, centered around the mine and the seasons. The men would go down into the earth each morning, emerge black with coal dust each evening. The women would tend homes, children, gardens. On Sundays, everyone who could walk or be carried would go to the Little Hope Baptist Church, the only painted building in the hollow. Afterwards, there'd be dinner on the grounds when weather permitted, each family bringing what they could for a shared meal. It wasn't much, but somehow when pooled together it became a feast. The mine shaped everything. It gave the men work, but took their health and sometimes their lives. "Coal keeps the lights on in America," Daddy would say with a wry smile, "but not in our own homes." The irony wasn't lost on him. He dug the fuel that powered cities he'd never see, while we sat by lamplight. The danger was always there, hanging over every family like the ever-present coal dust that settled on everything. Cave-ins, gas explosions, equipment accidents. Every miner's wife lived with the fear that her husband might not come home. And too often, those fears came true. April 12, 1954, was a Tuesday. I was 8 years old. It started like any other day, Daddy kissing us goodbye in the dark before heading to catch the mine truck. I remember he lingered a little longer than usual with baby Bobby, tickling him until he giggled. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I'd hear my daddy laugh. The knock came around noon. In the mountains, unexpected visitors was rare and almost never bringing good news. Mama was hanging laundry when the company man's truck pulled up. I was helping her, handing up wet clothes for the line. I'll never forget how she froze when she saw that truck, the clothespin falling from her fingers. "Stay here with the young'uns," she whispered to me, and walked slowly toward the man in the clean suit who stood by his truck, hat in hand. I couldn't hear what he said, but I didn't need to. Mama's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground right there in the dirt. The man awkwardly tried to help her up, but she just sat there, making a sound I'd never heard before and never want to hear again. a keening wail that wasn't quite human. Later, we learned what happened. The elevator cable had snapped as the day shift was being lowered into the mine. 12 men, including my daddy, plunged 400 feet to the bottom of the shaft. There were no survivors. The company man brought us $500, the standard death benefit, and official condolences from Blackstone Coal Company. $500 for a man's life, for a husband and father of 4. It wasn't even enough to buy a decent casket, let alone support a family. The funeral was a closed casket affair, the bodies too damaged for viewing. The whole hollow turned out, everyone bringing what food they could, the men awkwardly offering to help with things that needed fixing around our place. But once the funeral was over and the food was eaten, reality set in. Mama was 28 years old with 4 children and virtually no income. She took in washing, did more quilting, sold eggs from our chickens, but it wasn't enough. This was before the war on poverty programs, before welfare as we know it now. There was no safety net for a widow with 4 young children in the mountains. The church helped some, food baskets at Christmas, hand-me-down clothes for us kids. Neighbors did what they could, but everyone was poor. We started selling things, first Daddy's tools, then Mama's good dishes that had been her mother's. The garden kept us from starving in summer, but winters were lean. I remember going to bed hungry more nights than not. I stepped up as much as I could, took on more chores, watched the young'uns while Mama took in washing, learned to cook almost as good as her. I was still going to school, though less often. Miss Johnson would send extra food home with me sometimes, wrapped in newspaper and tucked into my book satchel with a finger to her lips. "Our secret, Betty Lou," she'd say. It was during the second winter after Daddy died, early 1956, when Earl Tucker started coming around. He'd show up with things we needed, a sack of flour, some fatback for cooking, a load of firewood. At first, I was glad to see him. He seemed like help sent from heaven. I was too young to see the calculation in his eyes, the way he looked at our place, at Mama, at me. Earl was about 45, a widower whose wife had died of pneumonia 3 years earlier. No children of his own. He was a tobacco farmer, a sharecropper working land that belonged to one of the big landowners in the county. He wasn't from our hollow, but from the next one over, Cane Creek, about 15 miles away. Folks around knew Earl, and not favorably. "That Tucker man drinks too much," I overheard Granny Opal, my mama's mother, say. "Got a mean streak when the liquor's in him." But he had a job, a house, just a rental, but still, and a steady income of sorts. For a desperate widow with hungry children, that was enough. I knew what was happening when Earl started bringing small gifts for Mama, a length of calico fabric, a jar of store-bought jam. But I didn't understand the terms of the transaction until much later. It wasn't romance, it was survival. "I need a wife to cook and clean," he told Mama bluntly one evening when he thought us kids were asleep. I was listening from the loft. "You need a man to provide, simple as that." And Mama, who'd buried her dreams alongside my daddy, agreed. They got married at the county courthouse in March of 1956. I was 10 years old. No ceremony, no celebration. Just paperwork and a justice of the peace. We moved to Earl's place the next day, everything we owned packed into his truck in a single trip. "Mama," I whispered, as we drove away from the only home I'd ever known. "I don't like him. He looks mean." She stared straight ahead, her face set in that expression I'd come to know too well, the one that said she'd made up her mind and talking wouldn't change it. "Hush now. He's going to take care of us. We'd starve otherwise." And even at 10, I understood. I'd seen how bad things were getting. I'd heard my little brother and sister crying from hunger. I'd watched Mama get thinner, giving us her portion more times than not. So I accepted Earl Tucker as my stepfather. I didn't have a choice. None of us did. When I turned 12 in March of 1958, something changed in the way Earl looked at me. I'd notice him watching me when I was doing my regular chores, sizing me up like a farmer might eye a young colt, calculating its worth. One evening, as we sat at the supper table, he suddenly announced, "Betty Lou's big enough now. Starting tomorrow, she's gonna work the fields with me." Mama's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Earl, she's just a girl. Earl's face hardened. I was working at 8 years old. She's 12. She's behind. And just like that, the conversation was over. In Earl's house, his word was law. That night I couldn't sleep. I'd seen the tobacco fields, endless rows that seemed to stretch forever under the merciless Kentucky sun. I'd watched Earl come in from them, exhausted and filthy, complaining about his back, his hands, the heat. And now that would be me. The knowledge settled in my stomach like a stone. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, there was a banging on the ladder leading up to the loft where I slept with Sissy and Bobby. Junior had a corner downstairs. "Get up!" Earl's voice boomed through the pre-dawn darkness. I scrambled down the ladder, blinking sleep from my eyes, heart pounding. It was still pitch black outside. The kitchen clock read 4:05 a.m. "Put these on," Earl said, thrusting a bundle of clothes at me. One of his old shirts and a pair of overalls that had belonged to Daddy. Both were way too big, but I didn't dare object. "No breakfast?" I asked timidly, my stomach growling. "Work first, eat later," he grunted. "That's the rule now." We walked to the tobacco field in silence, the first pale streaks of dawn just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The dew soaked through my 2 big shoes, chilling my feet. The April morning air was cold enough to see my breath. Earl led me to a small shed at the edge of the field and pulled out a tool I'd seen him use countless times but had never held myself. The hoe. It was an adult-sized tool with a wooden handle about 5 feet long and a heavy metal blade about 8 inches wide. He thrust it into my hands, and I nearly dropped it. The weight was shocking for my skinny 70-pound frame. "This here's your hoe now," Earl said. "You take care of it, it takes care of you." I struggled to lift it properly, the wooden handle rough against my soft palms. Earl watched with impatience. "You'll get used to it," he said flatly. "Now, your job is to chop the weeds between the tobacco rows. Not too deep, you'll damage the roots. Not too shallow, weeds'll grow back. Just right." He demonstrated the motion: lift, swing down, chop, move forward, repeat. It looked simple enough when he did it. Then he pointed to the field. "See them rows? They're about 100 feet long. There's 40 of them total. You do 10 rows by noon. I'll do 30. Then, after lunch, we'll do fertilizing." With that, he moved off to his own section, leaving me standing there, the too heavy hoe clutched awkwardly in my hands. I took a deep breath and began. Lift, swing, chop. Lift, swing, chop. The first few minutes weren't so bad. Then my arms started burning. The hoe felt heavier with each swing. My back began to ache from the bending. Blisters formed on my palms, then broke, stinging sharply with each movement. 2 hours in, I was openly crying. The sun was up now, beating down even though it was only April. Sweat mixed with tears on my face. "I can't do no more, Earl," I called out, my voice breaking. He straightened up from his own row, already 3 times further along than I was. "Yes, you can," he called back. "Keep going." I tried. Lord, how I tried, but my progress was painfully slow. The blisters on my hands popped, leaving raw, weeping flesh. Blood smeared the wooden handle, making it slippery and even harder to grip. By the time noon came, I had completed maybe 3 rows, not the 10 Earl had demanded. He came over to check my work, his face darkening as he saw how little I'd accomplished. "3 rows?" he bellowed. "I said 10. I tried. I really did." I started, but never finished the sentence. Whap! Earl's belt caught me across the back, the force of it knocking me to the ground. The pain was shocking, stealing my breath. "Get up!" Another blow landed as I struggled to my knees. "You don't stop till the work's done," he said, his voice cold as January. "Understand?" "Yes, sir," I sobbed, forcing myself to stand, despite the pain radiating through my body. And that's how it began. The pattern that would define the next 6 years of my life was established that very first day. Every morning, the 4 a.m. wake-up call. Sometimes Earl would kick the ladder. Sometimes he'd throw cold creek water on me if I didn't move fast enough. I learned quickly to jump up at the first sound of his voice. The consequences of delay were painful. By 4:30 a.m., we'd be in the fields, often working by moonlight until the sun rose. The early mornings were freezing cold in spring and fall, and I'd work with my teeth chattering, hands numb, until the sun finally warmed the air. Then would come the heat, building throughout the day until it was near unbearable. We'd work straight through until noon, when we'd walk back to the house for a 30-minute lunch break, usually just pinto beans and cornbread, maybe some buttermilk if we had it. Then back to the fields until 6 p.m., a 14-hour day for a 12-year-old child. And the work didn't end when we left the fields. After that, it was my job to fetch water from the creek. 6 trips, carrying a heavy bucket on my head the quarter-mile each way, just like the women in them Bible pictures at church. Then help Mama with supper, peeling potatoes or shucking corn or whatever needed doing. By the time I fell into bed around 9 p.m., I could barely move from exhaustion. The physical toll on my body was immediate and severe. My hands, soft from childhood, became a mass of blisters that first week. Every night, Mama would wrap them in strips of cloth soaked in an herbal solution she made. Yellow root and comfrey, I think it was. It helped some with the pain, but come morning, I still had to grip that hoe handle with raw, bleeding hands. My back ached constantly from the repetitive motion of swinging the hoe. My shoulders burned from the unnatural position. My neck developed a permanent crick from looking down at the ground all day. At 12 years old, I started to move like an old woman. The worst part, though, was when Earl decided I wasn't working hard enough or fast enough. The belt was his favorite tool of enforcement, but sometimes he'd use a switch cut from a hickory tree, thin, whippy branches that left welts that lasted for days. I learned to wear an extra shirt under my work clothes to cushion the blows I knew would come. School became a distant memory. One day, about 2 weeks after I started working the fields, Miss Johnson came by the house. I was just trudging back from the creek with a water bucket on my head when I saw her talking to Earl on the porch. My heart leapt with hope. Surely my teacher would help me. "I was wondering why Betty Lou hasn't been in school," I heard her say. "She's one of my brightest students." Earl's reply was smooth as honey, but hard as flint underneath. "She's busy learning homemaking skills from her mama now. Getting ready for womanhood, you know. School don't matter much for girls around here. They just get married anyway." Miss Johnson frowned. "But she has such potential. She could go to high school, maybe even—" "We appreciate your concern, ma'am," Earl cut her off. "But we know what's best for our girl." Miss Johnson's eyes met mine across the yard. She saw my bandaged hands, the exhaustion in my face. I tried to send her a silent plea for help. She seemed to hesitate, then nodded slightly. "Well, if she ever wants to continue her education, please let her know my door is always open." As she walked back to her car, I felt my last hope of escape vanishing with her. No one was coming to save me. No one could stand up to Earl, not even Mama. In those early weeks, I still cried every day, from the pain, from the exhaustion, from the crushing unfairness of it all. But gradually, as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, something inside me began to change. The tears dried up. Not because the pain lessened. If anything, the work got harder as I was expected to do more and more, but because I simply had no tears left. My body adapted as best it could. The blisters on my hands turned to calluses, thick, hard patches that eventually covered my entire palms and fingers. I lost my fingerprints that first summer, worn away by the friction of the hoe handle. They never came back. By the end of that first year, my hands looked like they belonged to a 40-year-old field worker, not a 13-year-old girl. The Kentucky heat was its own special kind of torture. Summer temperatures regularly hit 90 or 100 degrees, with humidity so thick you could almost swim through it. There was no shade in the tobacco fields, just row after endless row under the merciless sun. The hoe handle would get so hot it would burn my hands, even through the calluses. I learned to wrap strips of cloth around it, but even those would heat up eventually. Sometimes the heat would get so bad, I'd see spots dancing in front of my eyes. Several times that first summer, I passed out right there in the field. Earl's response wasn't concern. It was anger. He'd throw a dipper of water on my face and yell at me to get up, calling me lazy, worthless, a burden. Meanwhile, my siblings watched what was happening to me with varying degrees of understanding. Junior, at 10, was old enough to grasp that something was very wrong, but too young to do anything about it. He had his own chores, feeding animals, carrying lighter loads, but nothing like the fieldwork I was doing. One time, when Earl raised his belt to hit me for dropping a water bucket, Junior tried to intervene. "Leave her alone," he yelled, rushing at Earl. My stepfather backhanded him so hard he flew several feet and hit the ground with a sickening thud. Junior never tried to defend me again. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. Sissy and Bobby, at 8 and 6, didn't fully understand, but they sensed the wrongness of it all. "Why does Betty Lou gotta work so hard?" I once heard Sissy ask Mama. "That's just how it is," was all Mama said in reply. The isolation of the hollow meant that although neighbors knew what was happening, no one intervened. Child labor on farms was common in those days. All kids worked to some degree. But Earl's treatment of me was extreme even by mountain standards, and people whispered, just not loud enough to make a difference. As for me, I learned to survive by escaping inside my head. While my body worked mechanically in the field, lift, swing, chop, move forward, repeat, my mind would be elsewhere. I'd imagine being back in school, learning from books. I'd make up stories about places I'd never seen. Big cities with tall buildings, oceans with waves bigger than houses. I'd recite the poems Miss Johnson had taught me over and over like prayers. It wasn't living, it was surviving. And for the next 6 years, that's all I did. The pattern set in those first brutal months continued without mercy from 1958 to 1960, as I grew from 12 to 14 years old. There was no break in the cycle of work. Tobacco farming is year-round labor. When we weren't planting, we were weeding. When we weren't weeding, we were harvesting. When we weren't harvesting, we were stripping leaves. When we weren't stripping, we were preparing fields for the next season. The wheel turned endlessly, and I was trapped on it. My body paid a terrible price. While other girls my age were growing taller, filling out, blooming into young womanhood, I seemed frozen in time. Malnutrition and overwork stunted my growth. I'd stop at just 5 feet tall and never gain more than 100 pounds my entire life. My monthly cycles, which should have started around 12 or 13, didn't come until I was nearly 15, the stress and poor nutrition delaying what should have been normal development. The physical pain became my constant companion. My back, bent for countless hours over tobacco rows, developed a permanent curve. My shoulders, strained from the repetitive motion of hoeing, ached continuously. My hips, jarred by the impact of each downward chop, throbbed when I lay down at night. Most horrifying, I began developing arthritis in my hands and wrists before I'd even turned 13. Swollen, painful joints that a doctor would later tell me belonged to a woman in her 60s, not a teenage girl. A typical day in my life during those years would break most grown men, let alone a child. It started always at 4 a.m. with Earl's call, more a command than a wake-up. "Betty Lowe, up!" Sometimes he'd kick the ladder to my loft sleeping area. Other times he'd throw cold creek water on me if I didn't move fast enough. After a few weeks of this treatment, my body developed an almost supernatural alertness. I'd jolt awake at 3:58 a.m., my heart already racing, body already tensing for the ordeal ahead. By 4:15, I'd be dressed in the same filthy work clothes from the day before. We rarely had time or energy for washing more than once a week. Some mornings, Mama would slip me a piece of leftover cornbread or a biscuit, but most days there was nothing until lunch. "Empty stomach makes for a harder worker," Earl would say, though he always had his breakfast before heading out. We'd be in the fields by 4:30 a.m., often working by moonlight or the weak glow of a kerosene lantern until sunrise. The pre-dawn hours were bitter cold, even in summer. My fingers would go numb, making it even harder to grip the hoe. My breath would cloud in front of me, and I'd shiver so hard my teeth chattered. Earl never seemed affected by the cold, or if he was, he never showed it. As the sun rose around 6 a.m., I'd already been working for an hour and a half. The first rays would seem like a blessing, warming my frozen hands, but that gratitude was always short-lived. By 8 a.m., especially in summer, the temperature would already be climbing into the 80s, the humidity making it hard to breathe. By 10 a.m., with the thermometer pushing 100 degrees, I'd be soaked with sweat, dizzy from heat and exertion. Water was strictly rationed, one dipper, about a cup, every 2 hours. Earl said too much water made workers lazy. The reality was that every trip to the water bucket meant minutes not working, and Earl couldn't abide wasted time. I passed out from heat stroke at least a dozen times those first few summers. Earl's response was always the same. He'd douse me with water, not out of concern, but to get me back to work faster, and then berate me for my weakness. "Get up, lazy. Sun ain't even at high noon yet, and you're already fainting like some delicate city girl." Noon brought our only real break of the day. A 30-minute lunch, usually pinto beans and cornbread, maybe some buttermilk to drink if the cow was producing well. The food, plain as it was, tasted like heaven to my starved body. I'd wolf it down and then, if Earl wasn't watching, close my eyes for a precious few minutes of rest before the afternoon shift began. The hours from 12:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. were the worst, the hottest part of the day, when the sun seemed to hang directly overhead for hours, beating down without mercy. The air shimmered with heat above the tobacco rows. The plants exuded a sticky substance that coated arms and face, attracting insects and dirt. The hoe handle, baked by hours in the sun, became so hot it would raise blisters even through my calluses. It was during these afternoon hours that I sometimes experienced strange visions, hallucinations brought on by heat stroke and exhaustion. I'd see my dead daddy walking between the tobacco rows, checking the plants like he was the farmer instead of the coal miner he'd been. He'd look at me with such sadness in his eyes. "Hold on, baby girl," he'd say. "Just hold on." Then he'd fade away like morning mist, leaving me wondering if I was losing my mind. At 6 p.m., we'd finally leave the fields, but my workday was far from over. Next came the water fetching, 6 trips to and from the creek, a quarter-mile each way, carrying a heavy wooden bucket balanced on my head, Appalachian style. The weight of it compressed my neck vertebrae and spine, causing damage that would plague me with headaches for decades to come. But it was the only way to get enough water for cooking, cleaning, and washing. After water duty came helping Mama with supper, peeling potatoes, shucking corn, snapping beans, whatever was needed. By this point, I was moving like an automation, my body operating on some reserve of energy I didn't know existed. My mind would often float above it all, watching myself work as if from a distance, a survival mechanism I now know is called dissociation. Around 8 p.m., we'd finally sit down to eat, Earl at the head of the table, taking the best portions for himself. The rest of us got what was left. I was usually too exhausted to taste the food, shoveling it mechanically into my mouth because I knew I needed the energy for tomorrow. After supper, there were dishes to wash, floors to sweep, and finally, blessed sleep. By 8:30 or 9 p.m., I'd climb up to my loft, collapse onto my straw mattress in the corner I shared with Sissy and Bobby, and fall instantly into a dreamless sleep so profound it was like death. My body was too exhausted even to dream. And then 4 a.m. would come again, and the cycle would repeat. There were no days off, not even Sundays. "Animals don't rest on Sunday, neither do we," Earl would say. "Tobacco don't know it's the Lord's day." Occasionally, we'd go to church, which was the only respite in my life. For those 2 hours, I could sit still, listen to singing, and pretend I was a normal girl. But often Earl would declare there was too much work, and we'd stay home while he supervised my labor. Holidays meant nothing in Earl's world. Christmas might bring a half day of work instead of a full day, and maybe a biscuit with a spoonful of jam as a special treat. That was it. No presents, no celebration. Easter, Thanksgiving, the 4th of July. All passed without acknowledgement. Independence Day don't mean nothing to tobacco plants, Earl said once, when I dared ask if we might take the holiday off. To survive mentally, I developed the ability to escape inside my head while my body worked. I'd imagine being back in school, sitting at a desk, learning about far-off places and amazing things. I'd picture myself in Cincinnati, the nearest big city I'd heard of, walking down paved streets in a pretty dress, eating in a restaurant, sleeping in a real bed with a mattress. These fantasies kept me sane when reality became unbearable. My health suffered in ways beyond the obvious physical injuries. I developed chronic infections from cuts and blisters that never fully healed before being reopened by work. We couldn't afford a doctor, so Mama would treat me with home remedies, poultices made from herbs she gathered in the woods, teas brewed from roots and leaves. Some helped, many didn't. Several times, infections in my hands or feet became so bad that I ran high fevers, my limbs swelling and oozing. Even then, Earl insisted I work. "Fever ain't gonna kill you, but laziness might," he'd say, forcing me back into the fields despite Mama's quiet protests. The malnutrition was perhaps the most damaging in the long term. I was burning far more calories than I consumed, probably 3,000 plus a day in hard physical labor while eating maybe 100-200 calories of mostly beans and cornbread. My body was constantly in deficit, breaking down its own muscle and bone to keep functioning. My hair thinned, my teeth developed cavities that went unfilled, my skin erupted in sores that wouldn't heal. My growth simply stopped. At 14, I was the same size I'd been at 12, just more weathered, more worn. Emotionally, I shut down. The technical term is depression, though nobody called it that then. My affect flattened. No smiles, no tears, just a blank stare. I stopped feeling joy in anything. Hope abandoned me completely. I existed in pure survival mode, operating on animal instinct: wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. As I approached 14, my little brother Junior, now 10, was working more too, though still not as hard as me. Earl maintained that as the oldest girl, I had to pull my weight more than the others. Junior felt guilty about this disparity. "Why don't he make me do more?" he asked me once as we fetched water together. "Don't matter," I told him. "Just be glad it ain't you." I never blamed Junior or resented his lighter workload. If anything, I was relieved that at least one of us was being spared the worst of Earl's exploitation. Sissy and Bobby, at 8 and 6, were still too young for field work, though Earl had plans for them too as they grew. The thought of my little sister being forced into the same life made me physically ill. Through it all, Mama watched and did nothing. At night sometimes, I'd hear her crying softly in her room, but by day she maintained a silent compliance with Earl's regime. Once, during a rare moment alone with her, I confronted her directly. "Mama, why don't you stop him?" I asked, showing her my bleeding hands after a particularly brutal day. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I can't, baby. He'll throw us out. We'll starve." "I'm already starvin', Mama," I cried, my voice breaking with rare emotion. She turned away, unable to face the truth of what she was allowing to happen to her child. The conversation was over, and with it, my last hope that she might somehow intervene. As I entered my 3rd year of this existence, I began to wonder how long a person could survive such treatment. Would I die in those fields? Would Earl work me until I collapsed one day and simply didn't get up again? Or would I live to 18, when I might legally be able to leave? I had no way of knowing then that my life would change completely on a hot June day in 1964, when the man who had stolen my childhood would suddenly find our roles reversed, him helpless, me with the power. But that day was still years away, and many more hours of suffering lay between me and freedom. By the time I turned 15 in 1961, something inside me had begun to change. The empty resignation that had helped me survive the past 3 years started giving way to questions, to anger. I began to notice things that had once seemed normal, like why I had to work harder than Junior, even though he was getting bigger and stronger too. "Why do I gotta work harder than Junior?" I asked Earl one morning as we headed to the fields, my voice sounding strange to my own ears after so many months of near silence. Earl barely glanced at me. "'Cause you're bigger and stronger," he said, though it wasn't true. I was stunted from years of overwork and poor nutrition. "And 'cause I say so," he added, making it clear the conversation was over. But something had awakened in me that wouldn't be silenced again. The questions kept coming in my head, even if I was smart enough not to speak them aloud. Why was this happening to me? Why did Mama let it happen? Would it ever end? One morning in early April of that year, when Earl called me to get up at 4 a.m., I didn't move. I lay in my loft, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, my body tense, but my mind strangely calm. I heard his heavy footsteps crossing the main room below, heard the creak of the ladder as he began to climb. "You defyin' me?" His face appeared above the edge of the loft, red with fury. I said nothing, just stared at him. That seemed to enrage him more than any words could have. He lunged up the last few rungs, grabbed my arm in a grip so tight I felt my bones might snap, and yanked me from my bed. Still in my nightgown, I was dragged down the ladder, my legs banging painfully against each rung, and thrown outside into the cold April dawn. "You want to be lazy? Sleep outside like a dog." Earl slammed the door, and I heard the bolt slide home. The night air was frigid, maybe 40 degrees, and I had nothing but my thin cotton nightgown. I huddled against the side of the house, shivering uncontrollably, watching the stars slowly fade as dawn approached. By the time the sun rose, my lips were blue, my fingers numb, and I had learned another painful lesson. Direct defiance would not work. But I wasn't ready to give up. The following Sunday, I managed to speak with Granny Opal, my mama's mother, after church. Granny lived about 3 miles away in her own small cabin, and I hadn't seen much of her since we'd moved to Earl's place. Earl didn't like her, probably because she was the only one who dared to look at him with open disapproval. "Granny, I can't take it no more," I whispered when I found a moment alone with her. I showed her my hands, gnarled already at 15, with thick calluses and healing cuts. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, honey, I know." "Can I stay here?" I asked desperately. "With you?" Granny shook her head slowly, her own weathered hands clasping mine. "Baby, I can't. I got no money, no room." She looked around to make sure no one was listening, then added, "And Earl would come get you anyway. He's your legal guardian till you're 18. "So I'm stuck?" The blunt truth of it hit me like a physical blow. Granny nodded, tears now spilling down her cheeks. Just hold on. 3 more years. 3 years. More than 1,000 days. It felt like eternity. I thought about running away. Many nights, lying awake despite my bone-deep exhaustion, I'd plan my escape. But where would I go? I had no money, no transportation. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and beyond that was a world I knew nothing about. I'd heard stories of mountain girls who ran away to cities, only to end up in situations even worse than what they left: prostitution, drug addiction, living on the streets. Fear kept me in place as much as Earl's belt did. As I got older and stronger, Earl's expectations increased. It was never enough. If I managed 10 rows one day, he'd demand 15 the next. If I carried 6 water buckets, he'd insist I could handle 8. The goalposts kept moving, always just beyond what I could possibly achieve. The physical abuse escalated too. It wasn't just belts and switches anymore. When I was 16, Earl hit me with his fist for the first time when I dropped a bucket of tobacco seedlings. The blow caught me on the side of my face, spinning me around and knocking me to the ground. Stars exploded in my vision, and I tasted blood. Another time, when I was moving too slowly for his liking, he kicked me hard in the ribs. I felt something crack inside, a sharp, tearing pain that made breathing agony for weeks afterward. There was no doctor, of course. Mama bound my torso with strips of cloth and fed me willow bark tea for the pain. The rib healed crooked, leaving me with a funny catch in my breath that remains to this day. Junior, who was 13 by then and working more in the fields himself, tried to intervene once. "Earl, she's doing her best," he shouted when Earl raised his hand to hit me for missing a weed. Earl turned on him like a striking snake, backhanding him so hard that Junior went sprawling in the dirt, blood spurting from his nose. "Stop! He's just a boy," Mama cried, running from where she'd been working nearby. Earl's gaze swung toward her, his hand still raised. "You want some too?" Mama fell silent, shrinking back. The threat worked. Junior and I learned from that incident that solidarity would only get us both hurt. It was better to endure alone than to watch someone you love suffer for trying to help you. I tried once more to get help, this time from outside our family. Miss Johnson, my beloved teacher, had moved away, replaced by a younger man named Mr. Daniels. One day when Earl was in town on business, I managed to slip away and walk the 3 miles to school, hoping to find an ally. Mr. Daniels was grading papers when I knocked timidly on the schoolhouse door. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Betty Lou Jenkins? Haven't seen you in, must be 3 years now." "Yes, sir," I said, stepping inside. "Sir, I need help. My stepdaddy—" He held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "Family matters ain't school matters, Betty Lou. I don't get involved in how folks raise their children. But he beats me, makes me work from dawn to—" "Go on home now," he said firmly, turning back to his papers. "Your people will be looking for you." The door to help closed again. In desperation, I even tried appealing to religion. Reverend Brown had been preaching at Little Hope Baptist for as long as anyone could remember. One Sunday, after the service, I approached him while Earl was talking with some men outside. "Reverend, my stepdaddy beats me, works me like a slave," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm afraid he's going to kill me one day. Can you help me?" The old man looked at me with kind but unyielding eyes. "Honor thy father and mother, child," he said gently. "The Bible is clear on this. Earl is your provider now. You must obey. But Reverend, hardship builds character," he continued. "Go in peace, child. Pray for strength." Religion offered no salvation either. By the time I was 16, depression settled over me like a heavy blanket. I began thinking about death. Not in a planning way at first, just wondering if it might be a relief. I'd look at the creek when fetching water, thinking how easy it would be to just walk in and keep going, let the current take me. Or the rope in the barn that Earl used for tying tobacco. How simple to fashion a noose. I never acted on these thoughts, not because I found hope, but from a kind of stubborn defiance. I ain't given him that satisfaction, I'd think. Earl had taken so much from me already. I wouldn't let him take my life too. Instead, I began a small, secret rebellion. Earl kept cash in a coffee can on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard, money from tobacco sales, his emergency fund. When no one was looking, I started taking tiny amounts. A quarter here, 50 cents there. Amounts so small he wouldn't notice, but that would add up over time. For months, I squirreled away these stolen coins in a hiding spot under a loose floorboard in the loft. By the spring of 1963, when I was 17, I'd accumulated about $15, a fortune to me, enough for a bus ticket to Cincinnati and maybe a few meals when I got there. I was planning to run on my 18th birthday, less than a year away. Then one day, Earl found my hiding place. I never knew what made him look under that particular floorboard. Maybe he'd noticed it was loose, or perhaps he'd been suspicious all along. I was in the field when I heard him bellow my name with a fury that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Betty Lou, get up here!" I ran to the house, my heart pounding. Earl stood in the main room, my precious money clutched in his fist, his face dark with rage. "You been stealing from me?" Before I could answer, his fist connected with my jaw, sending me crashing into the wall. What followed was the worst beating of my life. Fists, belt, kicks, all, while Mama watched from the corner, crying silently but doing nothing to intervene. When it was over, I lay on the floor, bloodied and barely conscious. Earl took all the money I'd saved and spent it on moonshine that weekend. My hope of escape was gone. But something else happened that day, something Earl couldn't have anticipated. The last fragile thread of fear that had kept me in line snapped. I no longer cared what he did to me. The worst had already happened, and I was still alive. On March 18, 1964, I turned 18, legally an adult. I could leave now without fear of being brought back, but the practical barriers remained. No money, no education beyond 6th grade, no skills except farming. I felt trapped, despite my new legal status. Still, something fundamental had shifted inside me. Being 18 meant something. A psychological barrier had been crossed. He ain't my guardian no more, I thought. I'm grown. I can leave. I began planning again, more seriously this time. A neighbor lady named Martha had once told me, "You want to get out, you come see me." I held on to those words like a promise. Earl didn't know I was planning. He still treated me the same, still expected the same backbreaking labor, still raised his hand when displeased. He didn't realize that his authority over me was now moral, not legal. And since I had no moral respect for him whatsoever, he had no real power left, only force. And forces, as they say, can shift in unexpected ways. June 15, 1964, started like any other summer day in the tobacco fields of eastern Kentucky. The sky was a harsh, cloudless blue, promising brutal heat by midday. I'd been up since 4 a.m. as usual, working the rows with Earl nearby. I was 18 now, legally an adult, though still trapped in the same daily grind of exploitation and abuse that had defined the last 6 years of my life. But something felt different inside me that morning. I'd made up my mind that I was leaving, and soon. I didn't have a specific date picked out yet, but the knowledge that my escape was coming gave me a strange sort of strength. Each swing of the hoe, each bead of sweat that rolled down my face, each ache in my back wasn't just one more moment of suffering. It was one less moment until freedom. Earl was in a particularly foul mood that morning, cursing the heat, the bugs, the tobacco plants that weren't growing quite right. He was working furiously, showing off as he often did, trying to prove that at 53 he could still outwork his 18-year-old stepdaughter. "I can still outwork you, girl," he called over to me, swinging his hoe with exaggerated force. "Always could, always will." I didn't respond. I'd learned years ago that silence was safer than words. Besides, I was focused on my own thoughts, mentally counting the money I'd managed to hide this time, in a hollow tree stump near the creek, where Earl would never look. Nearly $8. Not enough yet, but getting closer. By mid-morning, around 10:30, the temperature had climbed to 95 degrees. The humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. I was soaked with sweat, my threadbare shirt clinging to my back, my hands slipping on the hoe handle despite the calluses. I noticed Earl was breathing harder than usual, his face an alarming shade of red. Sweat poured off him in rivers, and he kept wiping his brow with a bandana that was already sopping wet. I watched him with detached curiosity. He didn't look well at all. Suddenly, he stopped working. His hoe hung suspended in midair for a moment, then dropped from his hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud. "Something ain't right," he mumbled, his words slurring slightly. He pressed one hand to his chest, his face contorted in pain. He took a stumbling step toward me, then another. I stood perfectly still, watching as he struggled to stay upright. Then he fell, first to his knees, then face first into the dirt between 2 rows of tobacco plants. His body gave a couple of small convulsions, and strange guttural sounds came from his throat. I stood there, hoe still in my hands, looking down at the man who had tormented me for 6 long years. He was having some kind of attack, a heart attack or stroke, I couldn't tell which. What I did know was that he needed help, and quickly, and I didn't move. In that moment, 6 years of memories flashed through my mind in vivid detail. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the blistered, bleeding hands, the broken rib that still made it painful to breathe deeply, the welts from his belt, the stolen childhood, the dreams crushed, the daily humiliation of being treated as less than human. Earl was moving his lips now, trying to speak. Betty. His hand reached toward me, trembling, pleading. I still didn't move. 5 minutes passed. Earl continued to struggle, his movements growing weaker. 10 minutes. The sounds he was making became more desperate. 15 minutes. His movements were barely perceptible now. I just watched. My face showed no emotion, no fear, no concern, no triumph. Nothing. I'd learned to hide my feelings so well that even in this extreme moment, my expression remained a blank mask. My thoughts, however, were racing. If I don't get help, he might die. The realization wasn't frightening, it was calculating. And Mama will be free, and I'll be free. Nobody will know I waited. I can say I didn't see. But then practicality asserted itself. Mama needs him for money. Without him, we're back to starvin'. And Junior's still too young to provide. It wasn't mercy that finally moved me. It was strategy. After about 20 minutes, though it felt much longer, I finally dropped my hoe and began walking toward the house. I didn't run. I walked, slow, deliberate. Earl's eyes followed me, silently begging for help. I didn't look back. When I reached the house, Mama was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's biscuits. "Mama, Earl fell," I said, my voice flat. She looked up sharply. "What?" "He's in the field. Fell down." "Well, go help him," she exclaimed, wiping her hands frantically on her apron. "I think he needs more help than I can give," I replied calmly. Mama ran out the door toward the fields. I followed, but slowly. By the time I caught up, she was kneeling beside Earl, who was still conscious, but barely. "Oh, Lord, Earl!" she cried, cradling his head. She looked up at me accusingly. "How long's he been like this?" "Just happened," I lied, the words coming easily. The first of many lies I would tell about that day. "Run, get help," Mama shouted. This time I ran. Our nearest neighbor with a truck was about a half-mile away. I sprinted the entire distance, pounding on their door when I arrived. "Earl's real sick," I gasped. "Fell in the field. Mama says to come quick with the truck." The neighbor drove Earl to the county hospital, 30 miles away over winding mountain roads. I rode in the back of the pickup with Mama, who held Earl's head in her lap, stroking his face and murmuring prayers. I sat as far from them as possible, staring at the passing trees, feeling nothing. At the hospital, the doctor's diagnosis confirmed what I had suspected. Earl had suffered a severe stroke. The left side of his body was paralyzed. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. He would need intensive care and rehabilitation, but even then, the doctor warned, he might never fully recover. "He'll need full-time care," the doctor told Mama as we stood in the sterile hospital corridor. "Physical therapy, help with daily activities. He may not walk again." Mama sobbed openly. I stood beside her, silent, my face a carefully composed mask of concern. Inside I felt, not exactly joy, relief perhaps, and a cold satisfaction that justice, in its way, had finally found Earl Tucker. The doctor turned to me. "You found him?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "How long was he down before you got help?" I met his eyes steadily. "I don't rightly know. Wasn't paying attention. Was working other end of field." Another lie. The doctor nodded, accepting it without question. "Well, good thing you found him when you did," he said. "Any longer, he might not have made it." "Yes, sir," I agreed. "Good thing." Earl remained in the hospital for 3 weeks before they sent him home. He came back a shadow of the man who had terrorized me, wheelchair-bound, drooling, barely able to form words. The left side of his face drooped, giving him a permanently lopsided expression. He couldn't dress himself, couldn't use the outhouse without help, couldn't feed himself without spilling most of his food. Mama became his full-time caretaker. a role reversal that was almost biblical in its justice. The man who had dominated our household through fear and violence was now completely dependent on others for his most basic needs. The evening of Earl's return from the hospital, I went up to my loft and packed my few belongings into a paper bag: 2 dresses, an extra pair of undergarments, a hairbrush, and the $8 I'd retrieved from my hiding place. When I came back downstairs, Mama was helping Earl into a nightshirt. She looked up, surprised to see me with my bag. "Where you going?" she asked, though I think she already knew. "I'm leaving, Mama," I said simply. Her face crumpled. "You can't! I need your help with Earl." "No, Mama, I'm 18. I'm done." My voice was calm but firm. But... She looked frantically between me and Earl, torn between her husband's needs and her daughter's freedom. I walked over to where Earl sat in his wheelchair. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and alert, despite his physical limitations. In that moment, I knew he understood exactly what was happening. He knew what I had done, or rather, what I hadn't done, that day in the field. I saw the fear in his eyes, the dawning realization that I was leaving, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop me. I smiled then, a small, cold smile that contained 6 years of accumulated pain and rage. "Goodbye, Earl," I said quietly, and turned away. I walked the 2 miles to neighbor Martha's house in the gathering dusk. Martha was a widow in her 50s who had always been kind to me when our paths crossed. She opened her door to find me standing there with my paper bag, determination written across my face. "Miss Martha, I'm leavin'," I said. "Need a ride to town." She studied me for a moment, then broke into a wide smile. "Praise Jesus. I've been waiting for you to ask." She grabbed her car keys from a hook by the door. "Where you going?" "Cincinnati. Heard there's factory jobs." Martha drove me to the Greyhound bus station in the county seat, 30 miles away. Before I boarded, she pressed $20 into my hand. "You take care, Betty Lou," she said, hugging me tightly. "You're going to be just fine." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, feeling a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. "I believe I will." As the bus pulled away, carrying me toward Cincinnati and a future I could barely imagine, I watched the Appalachian Mountains recede in the distance. Those beautiful, terrible mountains that had been both my home and my prison. I was leaving them behind, along with the tobacco fields, the hoe, and the man who had stolen 6 years of my life. I was 18 years old. I had no education beyond the 6th grade. I had no job skills except farming. I had $28 to my name, but I was free. Finally, gloriously free. I arrived in Cincinnati on a steamy June evening in 1964, stepping off the Greyhound bus into a world that might as well have been another planet. The bus station was a chaos of noise and movement, people rushing in every direction, announcements blaring over loudspeakers. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching my paper bag of belongings, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. Cincinnati was enormous to my mountain eyes. Buildings taller than trees, streets wider than creek beds, more people in one block than lived in my entire hollow. The noise, the smells, the press of bodies, it was overwhelming. For one terrifying moment, I considered getting back on the bus, returning to the familiar hell of Earl's tobacco fields rather than face this strange new world. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was nothing left for me in Kentucky except more suffering. I had no plan beyond getting to Cincinnati. Miss Martha had told me that many mountain folk had found work here, so there must be jobs. But I had no idea where to go, who to ask, or what to do first. That first night, I slept in the bus station, curled up on a hard bench, my bag clutched to my chest. Nobody bothered me. There were several others doing the same thing, and the security guards seemed to look the other way, as long as we didn't cause trouble. I ate crackers from a vending machine for dinner, carefully counting out my coins. $28 wouldn't last long, I knew that much. The next morning, I walked the streets near the bus station, looking for any sign of potential work. It was pure luck. or perhaps divine intervention if you believe in such things, that I spotted a "Help Wanted" sign in the window of the Riverside Garment Factory, just 3 blocks from the station. With nothing to lose, I straightened my wrinkled dress, smoothed back my hair, and went inside. "Any experience?" the floor manager asked, eyeing me skeptically. I was painfully aware of my Appalachian appearance, the homemade dress, the worn shoes, the hollow cheeks of someone who'd never had quite enough to eat. "I can work hard, ma'am. That's all I know," I replied honestly. Something in my voice, or perhaps the calluses on my hands when we shook, must have convinced her. She studied me a moment longer, then nodded. "You start Monday, $1.15 an hour." I nearly cried right there. Real money. My money. More money in a single hour than Earl had ever given me in a week. With the promise of a job, I was able to find a place to stay. A boarding house, run by an older German woman who rented beds to single working women. $8 a week got me a narrow bed in a room I shared with 3 others, plus use of a communal bathroom and kitchen. It was tiny, crowded, and noisy, and it was the first place in my life where I had indoor plumbing. I'll never forget my first hot shower, standing under that stream of warm water, watching 6 years of tobacco field grime swirl down the drain. I cried. Not from sadness or pain as I had so often before, but from the sheer luxury of it. Clean, hot water, whenever I wanted it. No hauling buckets from the creek, no heating kettles on the stove. Just turn a handle, and there it was. A miracle. My job at Riverside started the following Monday. I was assigned to a sewing machine, stitching together pieces of dresses that would be sold in department stores across the country. The work was hard, the pace frantic, the noise deafening, the managers constantly pushing for more speed, more production. But compared to the tobacco fields, it was heaven. 8-hour shifts instead of 14, working indoors, out of the blistering sun and freezing cold. Sitting down while I worked, a luxury I hadn't known in years. Regular breaks, including a full 30 minutes for lunch. And every Saturday at 5 p.m., an envelope with my pay. Money that was all mine, that I had earned with my own hands, that no one could take from me. The other factory girls became my first real friends since childhood. Many were like me, Appalachian migrants who had come north seeking better lives than the poverty and exploitation of the mountains. They understood where I came from without me having to explain. They didn't judge my accent, or my lack of education, or my ignorance of city ways. One girl in particular, Sharon from West Virginia, took me under her wing. She'd been in Cincinnati for 3 years already, and knew the ropes. "You seem tough, Betty Lou," she said one day as we ate lunch together in the factory cafeteria. "I am," I replied simply. I didn't talk much about my past in those early days. The wounds were still too fresh, the memories too painful. But eventually, bits and pieces came out, especially with Sharon. She'd listen without judgment, occasionally wiping away a tear, but never offering the pity I would have hated. Sharon helped me learn how to live in the city, how to use a stove that didn't burn wood, how to shop in a grocery store, how to ride the bus, how to pay bills, how to read better. I was functionally illiterate when I arrived, having left school after 6th grade. She taught me city ways, how to dress, how to talk so people wouldn't immediately mark me as a hillbilly, how to navigate urban streets without looking like an easy target. That first year in Cincinnati, I worked constantly, 6 days a week at the factory, often volunteering for overtime when it was available. I saved every penny I could, slowly building a small nest egg that represented security I'd never known before. With my first few paychecks, I bought new clothes. The first new clothes I'd ever owned that weren't hand-me-downs or homemade. I ate full meals, real meals with meat and vegetables, and even dessert sometimes. My body, deprived for so long, began to heal. I gained weight, filling out from the skeletal frame I'd arrived with. My hair grew thicker, shinier. The perpetual dark circles under my eyes faded. Even some of the constant pain in my hands and back eased, though the damage from those years would never fully heal. About 6 months after I left Kentucky, a letter arrived at the boarding house, It had been forwarded multiple times before finding me. Mama had addressed it to Betty Lou Jenkins, Cincinnati, Ohio, not having any actual address. Inside was a short note, written in a shaky hand that I recognized as my grandmother's. Mama had dictated it, as she couldn't write well herself. "Betty Lou, please come home. I need help with Earl. He's bad off." I didn't reply. I couldn't. The very thought of returning to that place, to that life, made me physically ill. Months later, another letter came. "How can you abandon your family?" That one I did answer, with Sharon's help. "Mama, I didn't abandon y'all. Earl stole my childhood. You let him. I'm done. Don't write again." She didn't. In 1966, Junior showed up at the factory gates one day. I was leaving after my shift, tired but content, when I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned to see my little brother. Not so little anymore at 18, tall and lanky, with our daddy's eyes. "Junior!" I ran to him, throwing my arms around his neck. We clung to each other, both crying without shame. He'd left the same way I had, he told me, just packed a bag and walked out. "I couldn't take it no more," he said. "Not after seeing what he did to you, what he started doing to Sissy." My heart clenched at that. Sissy would be 16 now, just the age I had been when things got worst with Earl. "Is she okay?" Junior nodded. "For now. Earl can't do much from that wheelchair, but he tries. Mama stops him when she can." I helped Junior find a job at a warehouse near the factory and a room in a boarding house for men. We reconnected as siblings, spending Sundays together, rebuilding the bond that had been strained during those years under Earl's roof. It felt like getting a piece of my family back, the good part, the part worth saving. A year later, in 1967, I met Jimmy Watson. He worked at the rubber factory across the street from Riverside, and we'd see each other coming and going from our shifts. He was 25, also from Appalachia, West Virginia coal country, and had that quiet, steady manner of mountain men, but without the meanness I'd grown up with. He started talking to me during lunch breaks when we'd both sit outside on nice days. Simple conversations about the weather, about work, about Cincinnati. He never pushed, never rushed, just seemed to enjoy my company. When he finally asked me out, I was hesitant. My experiences with men had left deep scars. "I ain't gonna hurt you, Betty Lou," he said, seeming to understand my fear without me having to explain it. "Just dinner. That's all." That first date led to others, and slowly, carefully, Jimmy earned my trust. He was the opposite of Earl in every way that mattered, gentle, respectful, patient. He never raised his voice, never raised his hand. When I'd flinch at sudden movements, a trauma response I couldn't control, he'd stop, give me space, wait for me to feel safe again. With Jimmy, I learned that not all men were like Earl. That tenderness could exist without manipulation, that love wasn't supposed to hurt. It was terrifying in its own way, opening myself to potential pain again. But beautiful, too. We got married in 1968 at the county courthouse, a small ceremony with Junior and Sharon as our witnesses. I was 22, Jimmy was 26. We rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, nothing fancy, but it was ours. A real home with electricity and running water and a telephone. Jimmy worked hard at the rubber factory, eventually becoming a supervisor. I continued at Riverside. We weren't rich by any means, but we were stable, comfortable, secure in a way I had never known growing up. Our first child, Tommy, arrived in 1969, followed by Linda in 1971 and James Jr. in 1974. From the moment I held my first baby, I was determined to be a different kind of parent than what I had experienced. I never hit my children, not once. I rarely even raised my voice. I let them be children, play, explore, make messes, make mistakes. Most importantly, I made sure they went to school regularly, even when it would have been convenient to keep them home to help with younger siblings. "Y'all gonna have what I didn't," I would tell them. And they did. Stable home, loving parents, education, opportunities I couldn't have dreamed of in my hollow. I continued working at Riverside, eventually becoming a supervisor myself in 1975. It was a small promotion with a modest raise, but the pride I felt was immeasurable. From an exploited child laborer to a respected supervisor, a journey I could hardly believe sometimes. It was in the mid-1970s that I finally sought help for the emotional scars I carried. The city had a free clinic with a therapist who specialized in trauma. It was the first time I had ever told my complete story to anyone. The first time I had named what happened to me. What you went through was abuse, the therapist told me. Child labor exploitation. Systematic physical and psychological abuse. It wasn't your fault. Those words, "It wasn't your fault," broke something open inside me. I cried in that sterile office for what felt like hours, releasing decades of pain and shame and guilt that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was the beginning of healing that would take years, but would eventually allow me to speak openly about my past, to use my story to help others, to turn my suffering into purpose. The girl who had stood in those tobacco fields, holding that hoe until her hands bled, could never have imagined the woman I would become. But she survived so I could exist. And for that, I'll always be grateful to her. To the younger me who endured the unendurable, who held on when letting go would have been easier, who never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, a different life was waiting. In 1984, 20 years after I'd fled Kentucky, the phone rang in my Cincinnati kitchen. It was early evening, and I was preparing dinner for Jimmy and our youngest, James Jr., who was still living at home at 10 years old. The older two had already moved out. Tommy working construction in Columbus, Linda in nursing school at Ohio State. "Betty Lou Watson speaking," I answered, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Betty Lou, it's Granny Opal." My grandmother's voice, thin with age but still recognizable, came through the line. She was the only one from my past who knew my married name, who had my phone number. We exchanged Christmas cards, nothing more. "Granny, is everything all right?" It was unusual for her to call. "Earl passed yesterday. Heart attack." I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, feeling nothing. No sadness, no relief, no closure, just a strange emptiness where I'd expected some kind of emotion to be. "Okay," I finally said. "You coming to the funeral?" The question struck me as absurd. "No, ma'am." "Your mama's expectin' you," Granny said, a note of reproach in her voice. "She can expect all she wants." My tone was flat, final. After I hung up, Jimmy came into the kitchen and saw my face. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and meant it. "That man took 6 years of my life. He don't get another day." Jimmy understood. He didn't push, didn't suggest I reconsider, didn't offer platitudes about forgiveness or closure. He just hugged me, and we went on with our evening as if the call had never come. I didn't attend Earl's funeral. I didn't send flowers. I didn't acknowledge his passing in any way. He had died to me long before his heart gave out, and I felt no need to mark his physical death with my presence. Life continued. Our children grew. Jimmy and I worked, saved, eventually bought a small house in a decent neighborhood. I was promoted again at Riverside, becoming a department manager. We weren't rich by any means, but we were comfortable in a way I could never have imagined as a child in that Kentucky hollow. In 1998, 14 years after Earl's death, another call came from Kentucky. This time, it was Junior. "Betty Lou, Mama died, heart attack." I sat down slowly in my kitchen chair. Mama. Despite everything, despite her failure to protect me, she was still my mother. I felt a complicated grief, sorrow mixed with lingering anger, love tangled with disappointment. "You gonna come?" Junior asked after a moment of silence. I thought about it, really thought about it. "Yeah, I'll come." "Really?" The surprise in his voice was evident. "Not for her," I clarified. "For you and Sissy and Bobby. Y'all need family there." It had been 34 years since I'd left Kentucky. I'd never been back, not once. The very thought of returning to those mountains had always filled me with a cold dread. But now, With Earl long dead and Mama gone too, it felt like time to face the past, to close that chapter properly. Jimmy drove us down in our Oldsmobile, following the winding highways into increasingly narrow roads until we were deep in the mountains again. As the familiar peaks and hollows came into view, I felt my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. Jimmy reached over and took my hand, saying nothing, just offering his steady presence as an anchor. The hollow looked smaller than I remembered, sadder somehow. The poverty was worse. The coal mines had closed, leaving little employment beyond government assistance and the occasional odd job. Houses were falling apart, yards littered with broken appliances and rusted car parts. Children played in dirt yards, thin and hollow-eyed in a way that was achingly familiar. God, I forgot how bad it was, I whispered to Jimmy as we drove through. And it's worse now. The funeral was held in the same Little Hope Baptist Church where I'd once sat every Sunday. Only a handful of people attended. The community had dwindled as the coal industry died, many families moving away to find work elsewhere. Junior, Sissy, and Bobby were there, of course, with their spouses and children, a few elderly neighbors who remembered Mama. That was all. I approached the open casket hesitantly. Mama lay there in her Sunday best, hands folded over a Bible. She looked old, far older than her 78 years, worn down by a hard life that had never gotten easier. The lines in her face told a story of struggle, of compromise, of survival at a terrible cost. I felt, not sadness exactly, not anger anymore either, just a vast emptiness, a recognition of all that had been lost, not just my childhood, but her chance to be the mother she might have been under different circumstances, in a different place, with different choices. My siblings embraced me awkwardly. We were strangers, connected by blood and shared trauma, unsure how to relate to each other as adults. They had stayed in the hollow, living lives not so different from our parents, though without the extreme abuse I had endured. Mama talked about you, Sissy told me, tears in her eyes, said she wished y'all had made peace. Did she ever say sorry? I asked quietly. The silence was my answer. Then there was no peace to make. After the burial, I asked Jimmy to drive by Earl and Mama's old place, the farm where I'd spent those 6 hellish years. The house was abandoned now, the roof partially collapsed, the porch sagging dangerously. The tobacco fields had gone back to nature, weeds, saplings, and brambles reclaiming what had once been neat rows of plants. Nature healing over human exploitation, covering the scars with wild growth. I got out of the car and walked into what had once been the main field. The ground was soft under my feet, nothing like the hard-packed earth I remembered. I stood in approximately the spot where Earl had fallen that June day in 1964, looking around at the overgrown landscape. Jimmy came up beside me. "This is where it happened," I said quietly, "where he fell." "And you waited," Jimmy replied. It wasn't a question. "I waited," I confirmed. There was a pause, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. "You feel bad about it?" he asked finally. I considered the question honestly. "No, I don't. Should I?" Jimmy shook his head. "I don't think so. He hurt you for 6 years. You let him live. That's mercy enough." As we were about to leave, my foot hit something solid in the tall grass. I bent down to investigate and found a piece of rusted metal, the blade of a hoe, the wooden handle long since rotted away. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands. Could it be the same one? The very hoe I'd held for thousands of hours, that had blistered and calloused my hands, that had been both tool and torment? There was no way to know for certain, but it felt symbolic enough. I held the rusted blade for a long moment, memories washing over me, the pain in my hands, the ache in my back, the burn of the sun, the weight of exhaustion. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I threw it as far as I could into the woods at the edge of the field. "I'm done carrying that," I said, watching it disappear into the undergrowth. Jimmy put his arm around me, and we walked back to the car. We didn't speak much on the long drive back to Cincinnati, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who understand each other completely. That trip back to Kentucky closed something in me that had been open and raw for decades. I had faced my past, looked it straight in the eye, and walked away intact. The hollow had no power over me anymore. Earl had no power over me anymore. Even Mama's memory had lost its ability to wound. Life continued in Cincinnati. Jimmy and I grew older. Our children built their own lives. Tommy in construction, eventually starting his own small contracting business. Linda as a nurse at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. James Jr. following his father into the rubber factory, eventually becoming a manager. We welcomed grandchildren, 7 of them, all told. And I made sure each one knew they were loved unconditionally, that their childhood was sacred, that they would never know the kind of hardship or abuse I had experienced. In 2010, Jimmy suffered a massive heart attack while working in our garden. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. At 68, the man who had shown me that love didn't have to hurt, that men could be kind, that safety was possible, left me as suddenly as he had entered my life. The grief was overwhelming, but I wasn't destroyed by it. Jimmy had given me 43 years of love and security. He had helped me heal, had fathered my children, had built a life with me that I could never have imagined possible as that terrified 18-year-old stepping off the bus in Cincinnati. His love had been a gift, and though losing him was painful beyond words, I could be grateful for every moment we'd had. He was the good one, I told our children at the funeral. He showed me men could be good. I meant it with my whole heart. In the years that followed, I built a new life as a widow. I stayed in our house, refusing well-intentioned suggestions from my children that I move in with one of them or to a retirement community. This is my home, I'd say firmly. Jimmy and I worked too hard for it. I'm staying right here. I filled my days with my grandchildren, with volunteer work at a women's shelter, with the small garden Jimmy had loved. I wasn't rich. Jimmy's pension and my Social Security provided enough to live comfortably but modestly. I didn't need much. After the deprivation of my childhood, even simple comforts, a warm house, enough food, clean clothes, felt like luxury. At 78, I look at my hands sometimes, still gnarled, still bearing the scars and damage from those years in the tobacco fields. The arthritis has worsened with age, making it difficult to do fine work like sewing or sometimes even buttoning a shirt. The physical reminders of what was done to me remain, permanent and undeniable. But those hands also held my babies, caressed my husband's face, planted gardens, created meals, built a life. They took what was meant to destroy them and used it to create something beautiful instead. And there's a certain power in that, a victory Earl Tucker could never take away from me. In 2024, I'm 78 years old. My hair has gone from brown to gray to white, my face is mapped with the lines of 7 decades of living, and my hands, those hands that tell my story better than words ever could, are gnarled like ancient tree roots. Some mornings the arthritis is so bad I can't make a fist, can't button my own shirt without pain shooting up to my elbows, but I'm still here, still standing. And that's something, considering all the forces that tried to break me. I live in a modest but comfortable brick ranch house in a Cincinnati suburb. It's the house Jimmy and I bought in 1985 after years of saving and planning. The mortgage is long paid off. Jimmy made sure of that before he died, wanted me to have that security. It's not fancy, but it's mine, and after a childhood where I owned nothing, not even the clothes on my back, ownership matters. Since retiring from Riverside when the factory closed in 2005, I've lived on Social Security and Jimmy's small pension from the rubber factory. It's enough. I've never been one for luxury or extravagance. My needs are simple, my wants few. After you've gone hungry as a child, just having enough food in the cupboard feels like wealth beyond measure. My 3 children live nearby. Tommy runs his own construction company now, specializing in affordable housing renovations. Linda is head nurse in the pediatric ward at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. James Jr. manages the shipping department at the same rubber factory where his daddy worked for 30 years. All college-educated, all homeowners, all stable and successful in ways my parents could never have imagined. I have 7 grandkids ranging from 8 to 24 years old. The older ones are in college or starting their careers. The younger ones still bring me crayon drawings and climb into my lap for stories. I spoil them, not with expensive gifts. I still believe in the value of earning what you get, but with time, attention, love, and occasional treats that would have seemed like impossible luxuries to the child I once was. When my grandchildren ask about my hands, why they look the way they do, why they're so different from other grandma's hands, I tell them, that's a story for when you're older. And it is. There are parts of my life they're still too young to hear. But I make sure they know certain things clearly, that they are loved unconditionally, that their childhood is precious and should be protected, that school matters, education is the one thing nobody can take from you, that they should never stay silent if someone is hurting them, that adults who love them don't make them afraid. These are the lessons I learned the hard way, and I'm determined my grandchildren will never have to learn them the same way I did. My relationship with my own children has evolved over the years. When they were young, I was fiercely protective, perhaps too much so, though they've never complained. I couldn't bear to see them work too hard, to miss school for any reason, to ever feel the kind of exhaustion or pain I knew so intimately. Mom, they need to learn responsibility, Jimmy would sometimes say when I refused to make the kids do chores they disliked. They'll learn, I'd reply firmly. Let 'em be kids now. It wasn't until they were adults that I finally told them my full story. They knew pieces, that I'd grown up poor in Kentucky, that my stepfather had been mean, that I'd left home at 18. But the details, the extent of the abuse and exploitation, the 6 years holding that hoe, that I kept to myself until they were old enough to understand without being traumatized by it. When I finally did tell them, sitting around my kitchen table one evening after Jimmy passed, they cried. My big, strong son, Tommy, the construction worker with calloused hands not unlike my own, sobbed like a child. Mom, how did you survive that? Linda asked, holding my gnarled hands in her smooth ones. You just do, I answered simply. You get through each day, then another, and eventually, you're free. For decades, I kept my story mostly to myself, sharing it only with family and very close friends. The shame wasn't mine to bear, I know that now, but old habits die hard. In Appalachia, we were taught that family business stays private, that suffering is endured silently, that you don't air your dirty laundry where others can see. But in 2023, I saw a documentary on PBS about child labor in American agriculture. The statistics stunned me. An estimated 500,000 children currently working on farms in America, many as young as 12, some working 10-plus-hour days in dangerous conditions. Children suffering heat stroke, pesticide poisoning, machinery accidents, children missing school to harvest crops, children like I had been. That was me in 1958, I said aloud to my empty living room, and it's still happening? Something shifted in me that day. The private story I'd carried for decades suddenly felt like a responsibility, a testimony that needed to be shared. If what happened to me was still happening to children today, then my silence was no longer acceptable. I contacted several advocacy groups, Human Rights Watch, the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs, the National Farm Worker Ministry. They connected me with documentarians who were working on a film about child labor in American agriculture. Telling my story on camera was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Harder than leaving Kentucky. Harder than building a new life in Cincinnati. Harder in some ways than the work itself had been, because it meant reliving every moment, every ache, every humiliation. But I did it. The words came out steady and clear, my mountain accent stronger than usual as the memories pulled me back in time. I was 12 when it started. I'm 78 now, still got the scars. But you know what hurts more than my hands? Knowing kids still going through it? knowing we ain't fixed this yet, not in all these years. The documentary, The Youngest Workers, Child Labor in American Agriculture, was released in early 2024 and featured my story prominently. It went viral, as they say now. Millions of views online, segments on national news programs, screenings in communities across the country. Suddenly, at 78, I found myself an activist. Me, Betty Lou Jenkins Watson, the girl who'd been taught that children should be seen and not heard, who'd had her voice stolen along with her childhood, now speaking at community forums, giving interviews, testifying before a congressional committee on child labor laws. I tell my story simply, without self-pity or melodrama. Just the facts, the 4 a.m. wake-ups, the 14-hour days, the hoe that burned and blistered my hands, the belt when I didn't work fast enough, the 6 years of exploitation at an age when I should have been in school, playing with friends, just being a child. And I always make sure to emphasize, this isn't ancient history. This isn't a problem we've solved. This is happening right now, today, to children across America. The agricultural exemptions in child labor laws that allowed Earl to work me like an adult in 1958 still exist. Children as young as 12 can still legally work unlimited hours on farms with parental permission. They can operate dangerous equipment, be exposed to harmful pesticides, miss school for harvest seasons. And those are just the legal situations. Countless more children work in conditions that violate even these lax regulations. Often after I speak, people will come up to me with tears in their eyes. Some are survivors themselves, with stories echoing my own. Others are shocked, having no idea such exploitation still happens in America. A few are angry, defensive. Kids need to learn the value of hard work, they'll say, or, that's just farm life. To them, I show my hands, these gnarled, arthritic fingers, these permanent calluses, these scars that never faded. This is what childhood exploitation looks like, I tell them. 66 years later, and I'm still paying the price. That usually silences them. Do I regret coming forward now, so late in life? Opening old wounds, exposing my past to strangers' scrutiny? No. My only regret is not speaking sooner. But perhaps the timing is right. In my youth, few would have listened to an uneducated Appalachian woman talking about child abuse. Now, in the wake of Me Too and greater awareness of exploitation in all its forms, people are finally ready to hear stories like mine. And I have something now I didn't have then. Power. Not the kind that comes from money or position, but the power of a survivor who has overcome, who has built a good life despite everything. The power of someone who can say, this happened to me, and it was wrong, and it should never happen to another child. The little girl who stood in those Kentucky tobacco fields, hands bleeding on the hoe handle, could never have imagined the woman I would become. She couldn't have pictured me speaking to crowds, appearing in documentaries, advocating for children I'll never meet. But I do it for her, for that child I was, and for all the children like her, working in fields across America right now, whose stories aren't so different from mine, despite all the decades between us. That's why I'm telling my story now. Because some evils persist across generations, hiding in plain sight, protected by tradition and economics, and our collective willingness to look away. And because silence only serves the oppressor, never the oppressed. I don't know how many more years I have. At 78, with the physical toll my childhood took on my body, each day is a gift I don't take for granted. But however much time I have left, I'll use it to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to be the advocate I needed and never had. My hands may be crippled, but my voice is strong, and I intend to use it. I know some of y'all clicked on this story 'cause you thought it was gonna be something dirty. 12-year-old girl forced to hold something hard and hot for hours. Sounds like one of them clickbait headlines designed to make you think the worst. That's okay. I ain't mad about it. I wanted you to click. 'Cause now you know. It wasn't sexual abuse. It was exploitation, child labor, a stolen childhood, and that destroys kids just the same, maybe in different ways, but just as surely. Maybe this way, people will finally pay attention to something that's been hidden in plain sight for generations. People often ask me about Earl. Do you forgive him? They ask it like forgiveness is expected, like it's the only proper end to a story like mine. Like without it, I'm somehow incomplete or bitter. My answer is simple. No, and I don't gotta. Forgiveness ain't required. It ain't owed. Earl's dead. He paid with his misery, those 20 years in that wheelchair, dependent on others for everything, just like I was dependent on him as a child. There's a kind of poetry in that, I suppose. A balance to the scales. Did I cause his stroke by waiting those 15 minutes before getting help? Maybe. The doctor said any delay could have made the difference between recovery and permanent disability. I knew that, standing there in that tobacco field, watching him struggle. I chose to wait. That's the truth. I'm not sorry for it. He stole 6 years of my childhood. I stole 15 minutes of his life. We're even. Some might call that cold, harsh, unchristian, but I've never claimed to be a saint, just a survivor. It's harder to talk about my feelings toward Mama. In some ways, I find it easier to forgive Earl than her. 'Cause Earl was evil, plain and simple. But Mama? She was weak. She chose him over me. Every single day for 6 years, she watched what he did and did nothing to stop it. That hurt worse than any blister or belt welt ever could. But she was trapped too, people sometimes say. She had no options. There are always options. Hard ones, scary ones, but options nonetheless. She could have taken us kids and left. We might have been poorer, hungrier, but we would have been free. She could have stood up to him, risked his rage herself instead of sacrificing her child. She could have reached out to family, to church, to anyone. She didn't. And she died without ever apologizing for that failure. So no, I haven't forgiven her either. And I've made my peace with that decision. What I want people to understand, really understand, is that this ain't just history. It ain't just some sad tale from the backwards hills of Kentucky in the 1950s. Child labor in agriculture is happening right now, all across America. The statistics are shocking, especially for a country that prides itself on human rights and child protection. An estimated 500,000 children work as farm workers in the United States agriculture is exempt from many child labor protections that apply to other industries. Children as young as 12 can legally work unlimited hours on farms with parent permission. Farm work is one of the most dangerous occupations, with risks including machinery accidents, pesticide exposure, heat stroke, and long-term health problems. Many of these children are from vulnerable populations, migrant families, undocumented immigrants, rural poor, without the power or resources to challenge their exploitation. Just like I didn't have. If you suspect a child is being exploited, there are warning signs to look for. Missing school regularly, physical injuries like cuts, burns, or broken bones, chronic exhaustion, malnutrition, developmental delays, fear of specific adults, isolation from peers, not being allowed to play or have free time. These are the same signs that were visible in me, that nobody acted on. Don't make the same mistake. If you see something, say something. Report to Child Protective Services, the Department of Labor's Child Labor Division, or call the National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. But what difference will it make, you might ask? The system is broken. No one will do anything. Maybe. But maybe your call will be the one that saves a child. Don't assume someone else will report it. Be the one who speaks up. I would have given anything for someone, anyone, to have done that for me. To those who survived experiences like mine, I want to say this. It wasn't your fault. You were a child. Children are supposed to be protected, not worked like animals or beaten into submission. What was done to you was wrong, no matter how it was justified at the time. No matter if it was called character building, or learning the value of hard work, or just the way things are. You survived. That makes you strong in ways most people will never understand. Carry that strength. Use it. Let it fuel you rather than drain you. To parents struggling with poverty, I understand the desperate calculations you might be making. I know some of y'all are poor, trapped in circumstances not of your choosing. I know it's hard, but don't sacrifice your children. There are other ways: government assistance, church help, community support. Don't let poverty steal their childhood, 'cause they only get one, and they'll remember. Oh, they'll remember how you protected them or how you didn't. Those memories will shape their whole lives. And to kids who might be living through something like what I experienced, being worked too hard, being hurt, being robbed of your childhood, please hear me. Tell someone, a teacher, a neighbor, a friend's parent, a police officer, anyone. Keep telling until someone listens. Don't give up. There is a way out. I found it. You can too. I'm 78 years old now. I've lived a good life since I escaped. Had a good husband, rest his soul. Raised good kids, got beautiful grandchildren, but I still got these hands. At this point, I'd hold up my hands to the camera, showing the permanent damage, the twisted fingers, the thick calluses, the visible scars. See these scars? This is what childhood exploitation looks like, 66 years later, still there. The physical scars heal mostly. But the emotional scars, those stay. They shape you, change the way you see the world, the way you trust or don't trust, the way you love or struggle to love. So if you see a child being exploited, do something, say something, be the person I needed back then, be the person who speaks up. 'Cause that kid's counting on it, even if they don't know it yet. About those 15 minutes I stood watching Earl after he fell, I've thought about them a lot over the years. Was it wrong? By conventional morality, yes. I was supposed to help immediately, to set aside 6 years of abuse and respond with compassion. But conventional morality is a luxury for people who haven't been where I was. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about right and wrong. I was thinking about survival, mine and my family's. I was calculating, in the instinctual way prey animals calculate when the predator is suddenly vulnerable, what this moment meant, what my options were, what the consequences of each choice might be. I chose to wait, and then I chose to get help. Not out of compassion, but out of practicality. And I've lived with that choice for 60 years now. People who haven't suffered as I did might judge me for those 15 minutes. That's fine. You weren't there. You didn't live through what I lived through. You didn't feel the weight of that hoe in your hands day after day after day. You didn't know the hunger, the exhaustion, the hopelessness. So you don't get to judge. What I did or didn't do in that field is between me and whatever God you believe in. And I made my peace with it long ago. That day, in June 1964, when Earl fell and I stood watching him struggle, I was finally the one with power. For the first time in 6 years, I had a choice. And I made it. If that's the price of my soul, so be it. At least I lived the rest of my life on my own terms, not his. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. See the invisible children. The ones working in fields and factories while their peers are in school or playing. The ones with haunted eyes and old before their time faces. The ones whose childhoods are being stolen right in front of us while we look away, while we buy the cheap produce and products their labor provides. See them, speak for them, fight for them. Be the person who says, this is wrong and it stops now. Because in America in 2024, no child should be holding that hoe.